This is Chapter 2 of Duval and Hayes, The Interpretive Journey. As we begin this lecture, we want to ask the question to help students begin thinking of the different reasons people turn to Scripture. The interpretive journey is the why do people all over the world read the Bible, and the method that we will use as you think of reasons why you other people read the Bible. It is imperative that you learn these 5 steps, because your paper, people sometimes use different methods to interpret the Bible. This interpretive journey. Some people use the intuitive, or see what this it just feels right journey is. How many times have you heard in a Sunday school class, "How do you feel about that passage?" And people will tell you their feelings. Doesn't mean that they are always right. In fact, and very often they are not right. There's a spiritualizing approach that some folks take, and then there's another approach where folks just shrug their shoulders. Say, "I don't know." Well, this underscores the fact that we absolutely need a consistent method of biblical interpretation that helps us understand all of Scripture. So, let's see what that method might be. If you watched that episode from the West Wing in the previous slide on YouTube, we have several points to make about that. Dr. Jacobs in that scene is not a biblical scholar, but rather she's a student of English literature, yet she is still expected to know how to interpret Scripture. Dr. Jacobs says, quote, "I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President. The Bible does," end of quote. This statement reveals her intuitive approach. The weakness of this approach is demonstrated by her inability to mount any response to the President's queries regarding Exodus 21:7, Exodus 35:2, or Leviticus 11:17, or rather 11:7. If Dr. Jacobs would have applied a spiritualizing approach, then she would be disregarding the very concrete nature that these injunctions address. And she didn't have an option of ignoring the difficult text because she's getting asked these questions by the President. Indeed, she has obviously addressed them on her public show. So, we must have a consistent approach that grasps the original meaning, then attempts to apply this meaning by accounting for cultural differences and formulating a theological principle. All Christians must be able to interpret Scripture. An intuitive approach will ultimately fail you. The interpretive journey is depicted in this little cartoon picture of 5 steps. This pictorial representation is a consistent approach to biblical interpretation, and there are 5 steps. Number 1, grasping the text in their town. Number 2, measuring the width of the river to cross. Number 3, crossing the principalizing bridge. Number 4, consulting the biblical map. And step number 5, grasping the text in our town. So the very first step, step 1, is grasping the text in their town. Now, class, here's the question. What did the text mean to the biblical audience? This is the first question that we have to ask of every passage we study. What this means is we must read the text carefully and make observations, study the historical and the literary contexts, synthesize the meaning for the passage for the biblical audience. The synthesis statement should use a past tense verb and refer to the biblical audience. Step number 2, measuring the width of the river to cross. The question here is, what are the differences between the biblical audience and us today? As we complete step 2, we are accounting for common differences in culture, language, time, and the covenant. That is Old Covenant versus New Covenant, Old Testament versus New Testament. Our focus is on the unique differences found in a specific text. So if you're studying the Old Testament passage, you must account for the life and the work of Jesus Christ. Students often get bogged down in this level of common differences that possibly have little impact on the interpretation of a passage. So, students, it's important for you to realize that to take the interpretive journey means that you must account for the unique set of differences that you're going to find in any given text. Step number 3, crossing the principalizing bridge. The question here is, what is the theological principle in this text? This theological principle is connected to the meaning that was discovered in step number 1. So to complete step number 3, you recall the differences identified in step 2. Then identify any similarities between the biblical audience and contemporary life. You hold the differences and the similarities together and identify a broad theological principle. Write out the principle, write out this theological principle that you are deriving, and use present tense verbs. Now notice the difference between step 2 and completing step 3. Completing step 2, we use past tense verbs. In completing step 3, you put it into present tense verbs. Now it's important to realize, class, that a theological principle should be reflected in the text, be timeless, and not tied to a specific situation. It must not be culturally bound. It must correspond to the teaching of the rest of Scripture, and it must be relevant to both the biblical and the contemporary audience. Now, do you see how critical this is for rightly dividing the word of truth? Step number 4 is to consult the biblical map. Now, the question here is, how does our theological principle fit with the rest of the Bible? So, to complete step 4, we have to ask, does this principle correlate with the rest of the Bible? If in the Old Testament, then run your theological principle through the grid of the New Testament. And step number 5 is grasping the text in our town. The question we ask here at step 5 is, how should individual Christians today live out the theological principles? So there you have it. There are the 5 steps. When we embark upon this journey, we are committing to the goal of grasping the meaning of text. We are not creating meaning out of the text. We are not seeking to put meaning into the text that was never there. That's eisegesis. We seek to find the meaning that is already there. Class, this is the purpose of this course. And we're going to spend the rest of the semester learning how to do this. Okay, so get these steps down. I would say memorize them. You're going to have to reproduce them in quizzes. You're going to have to reproduce this in the embedded assignment. You will have to do this to pass this course. So just memorize these 5 steps, and you will be so far ahead of the game. You'll be very pleased that you've done this at an early stage. So in completing step 5, we apply the theological principle to the specific situation of a contemporary Christian. There are numerous applicational possibilities because Christians today find themselves in a variety of situations. Now, as we will do throughout these lessons each week, you have the steps, the 5 steps. Now we want to use the example of Joshua 1 through 9. And we want you to open your textbook or the Bible to this passage and read it aloud and then see if you can walk through the steps and grasp the ideas throughout this example. And in doing so, you can use the text to check yourself. So see if you can do it. Really give it a try and go through each slide and see if you can answer the questions. And then use your textbook and the slides together to see how you did in the process. And that way you'll learn how to do it. We're going to do this over and over and over again. And eventually, as you do your paper, you'll be doing this on your own. See, we're going to show you how to do it each step of the way, and then we'll wean you off of our examples and out of the text, and you'll do this for your paper, and you'll turn it in at the end of the semester. That's the goal. You can see the whole picture right here in this second week, and that's going to be the goal of this course. And once you learn this, you have everything that you will need to do Bible study on any passage in the entire Bible. You're going to use this the rest of your lives. This is a great example and a great method. So, see how well you do. So, how did you do on that? Did you get some of the same answers? Did you see how they work the steps through the passage? We'll do this over and over and over again through all the different genres, the different types of literature throughout the Old and the New Testament. And by the time we get to the end, when you do your paper, you will know how to do this. It's going to be a great skill to have.